that was our first full year in production of Advisor. We hadn't yet finished a full year last time we were in person for this conference. And here we are in the 6th year of pulling data into Advisor and using that system. Nice change, I think, from NSSRS. How many people here actually worked in NSSRS back then? Yeah, there's a few of you, but most of you were never in that system. You don't realize how much different this system is than the old one. But the world has changed a lot since then. Education has changed a lot since then. And more importantly for us, I think, and on our team, is technology has changed a lot in the last 5-6 years. The things that you can do with data, the things you can do with technology has really grown. Some of the things we want to present on here today and tomorrow are on some of those data uses and on some of the things that can be done and how you can do it and what you should be doing to make sure you keep that data secure. One thing that hasn't changed is our need for quality data. The data that you provide to the Department of Education is used in a lot of different places. One of the main ones is your funding. You get state aid, and whether you're getting equalization aid or not, some of your money comes from the data that you provide to us. And quality data makes for good funding, and if you have poor quality data, sometimes that will affect your funding. And I have personally talked to the people in our state aid office about when those things have happened and how that has affected districts. So one of the sessions you're going to see tomorrow is actually going to be from our finance and state aid people about the data that they use. Accountability has been a big topic. It's something that our current system started before COVID, kind of had a bit of a skip and a problem with continuing through COVID because of a lack of assessment data. But again, we've had people with problems with their accountability results based upon incorrect data that they submitted. So that quality data shows itself and how important that it is, which is why we felt it was important to continue this conference when we were able to get you guys back together and talking about data quality and talking about data use and where it is important for districts, for schools, for the state, and even for the data that we submit to the federal government. Because NDE ourselves, we submit around 150 files every year to the federal government with data. It is aggregate data. It is not student level data, but it is data that impacts your districts. It impacts some of the funding that comes to the state and then flows into the districts. It also impacts the data that is published out on the website in aggregate function, or even just things like your district address. We recently got contacted by the federal office that handles some of the non-fiscal data because a school district contacted them about an incorrect school address. And when we went and looked, the data we were getting from the district in that school was the wrong address and had been for a number of years. So I think Naomi's going to talk a little bit more about that today in her session. So quality data shows up everywhere, and we want to make sure that what we're getting from you is good quality data, and we also want you to know where we're using data, how it's being presented back to people. A couple of the places that we, in turn, provide data, one of them is a group called the Nebraska Education Policy Research Lab. If you haven't heard of them, they are a collaboration between the Department of Education and the University of Nebraska system that provides education data for research purposes. And a lot of the students and professors at UNO, UNK, UNL use that data in order to do education research on different policies that can then in turn provide information on the best uses and solutions for Nebraska education. A second use, and a very important use, is what you're actually going to hear about now coming up next, and that is for NSERS. That is the Nebraska Statewide Workforce and Educational Reporting System. I always have a little problem with that one. I always have to read it off. So, Nebraska Statewide Workforce and Educational Reporting System. This is a As a entity, it was founded in, I believe, 2019, although the roots of it go back a number of years before that. Nebraska Department of Education is a partner in this work. We provide data to NSERS, and their executive director is here today to talk to you. I like Matt, but Matt did abandon us in the middle of COVID. He was my boss for a while until he went to take the job of the executive director. And we are very fortunate to have a good working relationship with Matt. We've known him, obviously, before he went to NSERS. And so we're also very fortunate to have him here to talk about how that data that you are submitting gets used and some of the ideas behind NSERS and whatever else he wants to tell you about. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Matt Hastings, the Executive Director of NSERS.
All right, good afternoon. Whoops, already broke the mic. Off to a good start here. It's nice to see everybody. This is precarious. All right. Well, it was a windy drive in. Did you all come in this morning, or were you here already last night? We're going to make this an interactive presentation where I ask questions and you respond. So how many of you were here last night? Oh, almost all of you. How many came in this morning? Okay, so maybe 50-50-ish. It was a windy drive, probably last night too, I'm guessing. But we made it in, and that's good. It's very nice to be here. Thank you, Jill, for the invitation to come talk with you all a little bit about NSERS and some of the work that we're doing. My name is Matt Hastings, as she said, and I serve as the Executive Director for NSERS, which is an easier way to say the Nebraska Statewide Workforce and Educational Reporting System. And as Jill mentioned, I'm a proud alumni from NDE, spent a number of years there, and it's really nice to see a number of familiar faces in the audience. I want to start by just saying, first off, thank you for the work that you do. You are in the trenches with a lot of this, I know firsthand, and it can be a challenge sometimes. But just as Jill mentioned, the work that you do is absolutely essential to support school districts in Nebraska, to support education generally. And so thank you for the time and the commitment that you put into this. And I probably know of no other group that's as committed to getting every single data element correct than maybe this group here, the data stewards that are in the room. So thank you for your work. It matters. It matters to kids, to schools, to communities and families. So we appreciate that very much. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today, just briefly about NSERS, but then I want to talk to you more about this notion of using data to empower decision support. And that's really what we're trying to do at NSERS, both in terms of the education space and how our education systems in Nebraska actually impact workforce-related outcomes. There are a lot of conversations going on in Nebraska right now, very important conversations about notions of brain drain, how we keep our best and brightest in the state, how we can maintain those individuals so the investments that we make as communities can stay here and continue to empower and support Nebraska. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we can actually use data, the data that many of you are providing to actually help us make better decisions. And that's an interesting discussion point, because you probably hear people say all the time, and you've probably sat in all kinds of meetings and conferences, that we need data to make better decisions, right? Again, the interactive presentation. How many people have heard somebody say or give a presentation on, we need data to make better decisions? Almost all of you. There are some of you, I guess, in the room that have never heard that. But people say that a lot, and it's true. The rub is, how do you actually do that in a way that you can do it well? because it's not easy, right? People try to do that a lot, and it can become very challenging, and it can become very challenging in a number of ways, not just philosophically how you do it, but also technically then how do you go to implement that, right? So I want to talk a little bit today about some of the ideas that we've had at NSERS about how we can begin to make that shift, right? I also want to mention at the beginning of this that my wife, bless her heart, last night I came home from work and I said, hey, I'm going to do this talk out at the NDE Data Conference, and it's been years since I've been there, and I'm so excited. And as I always do, I gave her a copy of my transcript, the speech, right? My wife's a leadership professor at the University of Nebraska, and so I really respect her opinion on any public presentations that I do because she does a lot of them. And she's brutally honest with me, right? Which everybody needs somebody in their life like that, right? So I hand my script over to my wife and I said, just take a look, and I said, I think there's some really neat ideas here. And so I'm going to play out for you how this happened, right? I handed her the 10-page manuscript that I was going to talk about. And I said, now you have to remember, I have an hour, so I want to make sure I can fill that. She goes, oh, okay, all right. So she goes and she's scanning through page 1, right? And she flips the page. She's scanning through page 2. And by this point, her eyes are starting to squint a little bit. And I know, the wheels are turning. She's squinting now on page 2. And by the time she gets to page 3, any of you who have a significant others will know this, right? There are no words at this point, but, after you're married 20 years or so, you don't necessarily need words to know what somebody's thinking, right? So we get to page 3 now, and I get the, right? And I knew at that minute that I would not be giving that speech today. And so then she continues on, right? She's now on page 4 and on page 5. And she's now past the sigh stage where she's in the stage, right? And so that's the context that I'm giving you to say that at 7 o'clock last night, we took that, and I took that and I ripped it up and I said, well, this isn't going to be presentable to you. So if this is a disaster, we're all going to collectively blame my wife, okay? Yeah, that's the truth. So what I want to do today is to talk to you a little bit about NSERS just briefly, give you some background, and then I want to move into this notion of information to support decision-making and how we're thinking about that, okay? And we're going to try to go through some real-world examples with real data using a minimum viable product, an MVP version of a product that we have, that at the end of this, I'm going to let you know that we're going to be opening up what we call NSERS Fellows Program, which is going to be designed to engage school districts, ESUs, higher education, public higher education in Nebraska, communities, workforce boards, to actually begin to use this information to support your decision making. But we want to kick that off with kind of a pilot group of folks who can be in our first cohort of NSERS Fellows. And so if you're interested in wanting to do that, I want you to find me after this presentation is done. Right? I will not have considered this a success unless there's some of you in the room that are willing to stop by and talk to me and say, hey, I'm really interested in that. We would like to be involved. Okay? So, about NSERS. As Jill mentioned, NSERS is a public body that was created through an Interlocal Cooperation Act, between 9 public entities in Nebraska. The Nebraska Department of Education, the University of Nebraska system, the Nebraska State College system, and each of Nebraska's 6 community colleges, and we work in partnership with the Nebraska Department of Labor. It's very hard to see on this slide, but the broad vision of NSERS is to create a data-informed decision culture that supports successful pathways of learning and earning in the state of Nebraska. Right? So that's really broad, that's really heady stuff, a data-informed decision culture. So again, we get back to what I was talking about at the beginning. What do we mean by saying data-informed and information to support decision making. That's really supposed to be at the core of what we're trying to do at NSERS. When you break that down a little bit further, our mission then is to integrate and organize education and workforce data to support decision making. Again, the emphasis that I want to place on this is that notion of decision making, right? So if that really is your mission, you probably have to ask yourself the question, well, what do we mean by data to support decision making, right? So if you're not picking up on the theme of this conversation that I'm trying to bring forward today, since I ripped up the script last night, is that we really want to bring this back to how this information empowers decision making. We think we have an example of how that can work. We know the feedback from you all will be very valuable in making that better, but that's really what we're going to focus on today. Okay, now for the fun part. This was originally 5 pages worth of discussion about the intricacies of the differences between data use in education for regulatory and compliance-based purposes and data for decision making, right? But that's the information that my wife so generously suggested would be a complete snooze fest. So we're not going to do that, but it is core to what I'm wanting to talk about a little bit today. So I want to set the context. What are we talking about when we say data use in education? There are different ways to think about that. There are different purposes for data. Some of those have already been described today, you know, and they are largely connected to things like regulatory and compliance-related work, which is absolutely, whether we like it or not, essential to the way that we do our work, right? We can't get around that fact. But our view is that the use of data for those purposes is different than what it can be for supporting decision-making. There are some key differences, and that then plays out in how you do things like analyze that information and then make use of it. And that's really what I want to try to highlight today. So when we think about data use for regulatory and compliance-based purposes, what we're talking about generally is a purpose that's to measure and report on performance, right? There are state statutes, there are federal statutes that define, here's data that you have to collect, here's certain reporting that you have to do, these students participate in this program, these students don't, here are some outcomes. Those kinds of things, you all are more familiar with it than even I am, right? Oftentimes the focus of that is on some specific outcomes, and you're using data retrospectively, right? Things have already happened, and you're looking in the past, and you're reporting to say, here's what occurred. Those results are typically used in things like evaluations or rankings, and basically a mechanism to decide whether you're complying or not with some kind of regulation. Ultimately, this creates, in some cases, some of these kind of higher pressure environments, right? High stakes environments that are then associated with the reporting of that information. That is different, in our view, from using data from a perspective of supporting decision making, where in that case, we're talking about using data to really guide your actions and to guide the strategies that you're putting in place at your district, at your ESU, at your agency, to achieve some objective that you have, okay? In that case, the focus really is on the processes that you're using and the potential improvements that you can make. And the key thing there is, from my perspective, is that the results from those kinds of analyses are really designed to help reduce the uncertainties that you have with the decisions that you're making within the education space, right? It's not designed to tell you, do this or do that, or it's designed to help support you in that decision-making process. So if you enter a decision, right, and you have this whole range of options, the information that you have at your hands and how it's analyzed and designed can help you reduce the amount of uncertainty that you have with the decision that you're going to make. It doesn't make the decision for you, but it makes you more confident in the decisions that you do make, right? So reducing the uncertainties is a key piece of this. And ultimately, the impact then is different. It's designed to really encourage an environment where that data is used as a tool then to help enhance the innovation that's happening in your district or your ESU, and ultimately then leads to this space where we're fostering growth and development, right? So there are different uses of data, and compliance or regulatory-based use is different than decision-making use. So, in ripping up my speech yesterday, my wife suggested that, you need some imagery to help to kind of codify what these different kinds of data use in education would look like. So I'm thinking back on how do I, pick an image that can maybe describe these different kinds of data use. So this is my first image, and this is a meaningful image to me because this is the first car that I ever had in high school. And I will give a crisp $10 bill to anyone in the room who can name the make, model, and year of this fine automobile. Does anyone want to make a guess and willing to be loud about it? Oh, come on. Okay, Scott?
1985 Buick LeSabre.
Oh, you're close. Scott said a 1985 Buick LeSabre. I'll tell you, you got the year wrong. 86, no. 88, no. 89, no. Nope, not 82. Folks, how old do you think I am? Yeah. It's actually a 1991 Buick LeSabre. Mine was a limited, which meant that when you turned the radio on, it had the antenna in the back that raised up. I mean, it was pretty sweet, I'm not gonna lie. Scott, because you came so close, you get the crisp $10 bill. Come on. There you go. You can buy me a coffee later. It'll take all that, probably. So maybe this is the example of data from education data from a compliance or a regulatory standpoint, right? It's a great car, right? A lot of great memories were made here. It serves all the core purposes that you need. It rides well. As I would tell my friends at the time, it actually is a luxury vehicle. So it serves the purposes that you need, right? Then what's the imagery that we would maybe use for data that's really designed to support decision making? Went back and forth with my wife about this. Ultimately, I decided to land on this. Does anybody in the room know what this is? It's a Cybertruck. You got it. This is the Tesla Cybertruck, which was recently released. And, I'm a big fan of this vehicle. I think it's really great. It's even better than that 91 Buick LeSabre. I actually signed up for, there's a waiting list for these. I signed up on the waiting list for this. My wife doesn't know that, by the way. And I'm anticipating when I get the email that says, congratulations, you're next in line for the Cybertruck. I'm going to mention that to my wife. And I'm probably going to be met with the, right? The same sigh that I got right before my script got ripped up. But this is a really cool vehicle. If you've seen any of it online, it has a 10,000-pound towing capacity, so I can pull my horse trailer with it easy. It has supposedly a 300-mile radius on one charge. It's made of, the body is stainless steel, and it's got the Gorilla Glass windows, which mean that it's basically maybe not bulletproof, but bullet resistant, which, is just, I don't hope to have people shooting at me, but it's just kind of cool, right? So this is maybe the imagery that I selected for data to support decision making, right? Really, really advanced stuff if we do it well, okay? So the question then, and where I started this presentation, was how do we actually do this, right? How do we take information and use it to support decision making in a really thoughtful way? There are a couple key things that we think are essential to making that happen. The first one is that you have to know at the get-go what are the outcomes that it is you're trying to actually move the needle on, or that you're trying to make decisions about. If you go into the process where you say, well, I just have some data and I think I'm going to use it to inform me, that's fine, but you're probably not going to get yourself to an analytic space where you can really create something that drives making a better decision. And again, what we mean by that, as I mentioned earlier, is help to reduce the uncertainty that you have around the decision that you're trying to make. So we've identified 8 core outcomes as a way to at least begin this work with answers. 4 education-related outcomes and 4 workforce-related outcomes that we're building kind of a suite of products around to support decision-making. The 4 education outcomes are pretty typical. You would probably recognize all, if not most of these. High school graduation, college going, post-secondary persistence, and post-secondary graduation. On the workforce-related side, we're looking at 4 key things. Employment gap, which is an occupation-specific estimate between the difference between the amount of individuals that are in a pipeline for a particular occupation and the amount of jobs that exist, right? So if you're looking at welders, how many folks are training to be welders versus the number of welding jobs that are available, the gap. Time to employment means after you exit education, how long does it take you to get a meaningful job? Industry placement is looking into which industry areas are you actually working, manufacturing, healthcare, IT, etc. And employment location is our way of beginning to operationalize this notion of brain drain. Are we keeping people working in Nebraska? Okay, so these are the first 8 outcomes that we're focused on creating these analytic tools around to support decision making. Very well defined, very specific. That's one key piece, we think, in having data to support decision making. The other key piece is creating a framework to drive your analysis analytically that are actually targeted on increasing the decision-making value of data. Okay, so what ends up happening here in these 6 stages of analysis as we've identified them is you take any of those 8 outcomes and you think about how would we create a data product across these 6 stages for that particular outcome. And as you move from the left to the right in these stages of analysis, the goal is that you're getting analytic products that are more and more geared towards really supporting decision making, right? That's not to say that the pieces that the analytic processes that are happening on the left-hand side of this are not important. In fact, we would probably say that they're fundamental, foundational. But as you move across this process, you're getting more and more utility, decision-making utility out of the analyses that you have. Okay, so when you're on the left-hand side, that's what we call the explore stage. And here's where you're examining what's known about an outcome, right? Literature reviews, for example. What does the literature say about high school graduation, for example? Key information to know. How that helps you in making a specific decision can be limited. You have to make a lot of logical leaps to put that information into action. As you move into describe, here you're describing the characteristics of your population and of your particular outcome. As you move into explain, you're going a step further to say, we know what the outcome is, but now we're trying to explain why that is the case. As you move into predict, forecast, and simulate, you're really shifting away from retrospective views of the data to using models that are trying to tell you about what the future might look like, right? So in a predict space, you're identifying what your expected outcomes are going to be. In a forecast space, you project those out 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years into the future based on an understanding that if you maintain the status quo or you make no particular changes, here's our best guess at what's going to happen. And ultimately, in a simulation space, you're given the opportunity to modify parameters to come up with what-if scenarios around the implementation of certain programs and their potential impact then on those outcomes, right? The kind of work that you're doing analytically in simulations is much, much more advanced, right, than what's happening in Describe, but it also then brings with it, if done well, much better decision-making value for the users, right? So our goal is to try to take those core outcomes that I mentioned at the beginning and to create a series of data products designed around these 6 stages of analysis to support Nebraska in decision-making for education and workforce planning. All right? Okay, so that's enough of the background. And what I want to do now is make a transition to a tool that we've created, a platform that we've created called Insights Plus. And it's the platform that houses these analytic tools across the 8 outcomes. This is also that platform that, as I mentioned at the beginning, when we kick off our NSERS Fellows program, that community of practice around using these tools, we would be working with you all to utilize the Insights Plus platform, okay? So I'm gonna pause there and shift over to Insights Plus. And we're gonna use a real world example. We're gonna look at high school graduation and how these tools can be designed across these 6 stages to actually support decision making. Does anybody else have a desktop that looks something like this? Because every time this it pops up, I'm embarrassed, but then it's just like, own it and let everybody see, I guess. Sorry, it's just the way I work. All right, I'm going to refresh this to make sure our internet's working. Okay, these are those 8 outcomes that I was talking about, and we're going to select high school graduation as what we examine here. So hold on, and we're going to walk through this. Okay, now what you're going to see here on the left-hand side is those 6 stages that I talked about, right? Explore, describe, explain, predict, forecast, simulate. And my goal here today, again, is not to give you some specific data. It's about showing you how these tools can actually be created across those stages and how those tools really look differently. And hopefully you will agree with me that they support decision making more and more and more as you move through these processes, okay? The first page when we land on it ultimately just gives us kind of a sense of the population that we're looking at. In this case, the population we've selected is on-time high school graduates in the year 2020. But I'm not going to go through the particular high-level results because we'll see a lot of them as we move through. So when you start in an explore stage, if you think about those stages of analysis, this is building our understanding of the outcome that we care about, right? It's that first step that you do when you're wanting to make decisions about some kind of outcome. So what we're doing here is providing, first off, a description of what the outcome is, right? How are you actually operationalizing that? And that's what I mentioned before, that anytime you're creating some of these tools to support decision making, you really have to know what the outcome is that you're trying to influence. You have to be able to define it, you have to be able to calculate it, right? And you all know that better than probably anybody. So here's a description of how the outcome is being calculated. And the next thing that we do is begin to look at why does this outcome matter? Right? So create the motivation for why you care about something. So this includes things like literature reviews. What does the academic and other literature say about high school graduation? What are the core influences on high school graduation, hopefully particularly in Nebraska? That's the kind of information that you're presenting if you're in an explore type stage, right? The first stage in these stages of analysis. As part of this, we would make available the list of references for the literature reviews that happen. There also might be external resources that, as you go through that process, where you identify, here's a lot of great pieces out there that talk to high school graduation, and make those available. All of that kind of stuff is happening in an explore stage. Again, valuable, and you get all kinds of this stuff from different groups. literature review type information, but limited in terms of how you can take that and actually make a better decision. Hopefully, as we move through the next 5 stages, you'll see how this kind of builds on itself. So as you move to describe, you're kind of taking that next logical step where you're saying, okay, we want to describe this outcome. So let's actually go ahead and calculate it. And then let's look at it in 2 other key ways. The first one is, what does that look like across time? And what does that look like across space? Right? So you take one outcome, and then you're looking across those 2 parameters. So you can see high school graduation across time is relatively flat, right, over the past decade or so. The other way to think about this is to look at high school graduation across space. So you could do that geographically, for example, right? Look at a map of Nebraska. In this case, we're showing ESUs and giving a sense of what the high school graduation rate is aggregated up to that space. But there probably are other geographic spaces that make sense to you that you want to look at. Maybe that's a school district, maybe that's a legislative district. And you know, as long as you can calculate that or put it in a geographic location, you can do that. And that's what we're doing here. Some people might look at this too and say, well, this is nice information, but I would like to know kind of what the frequency is of these high school graduation rates rather than just looking at it on a map. So in that case, you might want to take that information and put it in something like a histogram, where you can say, across all of the legislative districts in Nebraska, how many of those districts fall into the 85 to 91 category, 91 or greater. You say, well, these are the districts I care about for whatever reason, and I want a list of who they are, right? That's how you can use this information. The key is, in a described space, you're taking the outcome that you look at, and you're now examining it both across time and across space, right? You're describing what the outcome is that you care about. A next logical step that you might take is to say, okay, Matt, I now know what the outcome is. I know how it's calculated. I know what it is for my district or my region or the state. I know what it's looked like over time. But I want to have a better explanation for why our high school graduation is what it is, right? Because you're wanting to maybe do something about that. How do you do that? The first step probably is to take that outcome and begin to look at its bivariate relationships with other variables, right? So you're looking at what the high school graduation rate is across a range of other things. There are a lot of ways that you could go about doing that, right? You could just decide, well, I have a particular program that I care about that's focused on maybe male or female students, and so you could look at that particular breakdown, and we give the user that option here. But another thing that we try to do to make this a little more self-serving is to identify kind of a priori, what are the top 15 variables that have a relationship with high school graduation? And that's what we're presenting here in terms of these top impacts. And so what you'll see is, for this particular year, 2020, the variable that has the strongest relationship with high school graduation, perhaps not surprisingly, is high school GPA. So you can select high school GPA and then begin to get a sense of, okay, how does that GPA, based on your GPA range, how does your high school graduation rate look differently? So what you find here now is that, again, maybe not surprisingly, students that fall into this 0 to about a 2.4 GPA have a 59% high school graduation rate. As you bump up past that about 2.0 range, however, you see a significant bump up in that high school graduation rate, right? The next variable in terms of those that have a top impact on high school graduation is proportion absent. And by that, you can see we're looking at the proportion of school days that the student was absent from school. In this case, what you find is that the high school graduation rates for those students that are in from 0 to about 0.16 have the mid to high 90s for their graduation rate. But as you begin to cross this threshold from having about 0.2 to ultimately greater than 0.3 proportion of the days of the school year that they missed, you see this significant drop in the high school graduation rate, right? So You're trying to make decisions about what can we do to support high school graduation. You now are having some more information that helps to explain what the graduation rate is in your district or ESU or the state that you're looking at here, right? But you're only looking at one particular year, so you might say, well, I think for whatever reason in 2020, this is not accurate for what we normally have, right? So we really should be looking at this longitudinally or across time. And so you can select the longitudinal information and take an analysis of how have the graduation rates changed based on the proportion of, in this case, absences. And what you find is some interesting trends, actually, that among this group that miss more than 30% of days, we actually see this increase in the high school graduation rate over the past decade or so. You might have good explanations for why that is. But the point is, in an explain space, you can begin to really go through these variables and try to explain why it is you're seeing the graduation rate that you have. Now, probably in most of the regulatory or compliance-based frameworks, the reporting that you have, what you see in Describe especially, but maybe a little bit of what you see here in Explain, are things that are being produced. Right, you might see crosstabs for key outcomes, or you might see outcomes based across geographies. Right, that's not groundbreaking in any way, but oftentimes what happens is, our view, that's where the analysis ends. Right, and so when you really want to take that information then to support decision making, to help you to reduce the uncertainties that you're making, the uncertainties that you have around the decisions that you're making. You're stuck at that point. And so there's almost this imaginary dividing line now as we move from the explain stage into our predict stage, where the previous stages we're really looking still at that retrospective information. And as we move to predict, forecast, and simulate, we're using models to help us understand what the future might look like. Right? And that's designed ultimately, again, to help support better decision making. So now as you cross that threshold into the predict space, what we're doing here is we're using that model to plot two key pieces of information. First, on the y-axis here, we have what we call impact, and that's what we were looking at earlier, right? What are those variables that have the strongest relationship with our outcome? 0 being none, 100 being the most. And we also then plot that along the x-axis with influence. And this is the idea of, is this something that we as a school district, as an ESU, as a community can do anything about? Right? Because there are some things that you don't necessarily have control over. Right? I certainly recognize that. I think others do too. But if you can plot these two pieces of information together, ultimately what you end up getting here in this top right quadrant are those variables that have both a high impact on the outcome that you care about, and hopefully that's something that either directly or indirectly you can have some influence on. So take it back to decision making. You're trying to decide what is it that we're going to focus on in order to support high school graduation rate. In this things that matter plot, we're trying to help identify those things and draw your attention to variables that might be good candidates for your consideration, right? Supporting your decision making, reducing the uncertainty that you have around the decision that you want. So one of the things that matter is high school graduation rate, right? We looked at that earlier, or high school GPA, excuse me. And it's not that you can directly change that, right? It's indirectly through the programming and those kinds of opportunities that you offer your students. But one of the questions that obviously then comes up is, okay, we've identified things that matter. High school GPA is something that matters. You have limited resources, you have limited time, you have limited staff. Where do you focus your intervention or your program if you decide you want to focus on high school GPA? How do you determine that? That's what we're trying to do then when we populate the where things matter plot over here on the right-hand side. So we've selected high school GPA, and on the right-hand side, now we're talking about, okay, you've said GPA is something you care about. Where is it that you can potentially have the largest impact on the outcome that you care about here, which is, in this case, high school graduation rate? And what we're plotting here, again, leveraging the model that we use, are the predicted probabilities of a student graduating from high school across the GPA spectrum. So students, for example, that fall in a 2.0 GPA, the mean predicted probability for those students graduating from high school is almost 100% if they have a 2.0. A student that has a 0.6 GPA or 0.5 GPA has a probability of graduating from high school in Nebraska of less than 10%, less than 5%, right? But what happens here in this space, which is why it's highlighted in orange, is these are the range of GPAs or the range of students that fall sort of around that 50-50 probability. So they have almost a coin flip chance of whether or not they're going to graduate from high school, right? Those are GPA in a range of about 1.0 to about 1.4. So the point of this to support your decision making is to say, if you have limited time, limited resources, limited talent to be able to create a new intervention, where are you going to target that intervention if you're focused on GPA? You would be most efficient or get the most bang for your buck if you crafted that intervention to focus on this group that's at that 50-50 probability line, right? It's a thing that matters, and we're identifying where it actually matters. It's not just a scattershot approach. So you may also say, okay, that's interesting about high school GPA. We're particularly interested in our district about something like chronic absenteeism. So you do the same thing with chronic absenteeism. Here we're plotting the predicted probability of a student graduating from high school where they miss basically zero proportion of their school days all the way up to almost all of their school days, right? And so you see this sort of same graph appear where students that are missing about 10% of school days are still graduating from high school at almost 100% on average, right? Students that cross this threshold and they're missing more than about 35% of school days, all right, that's right here on down, their probability of graduating from high school drops below 10%, right? So now again, if we focus on those proportion absent ranges that fall kind of across this 50% threshold. Again, these are the students that are kind of in that 50-50 category. And if you were thinking about creating an intervention that was focused on chronic absenteeism and you were wanting to move the needle on the rate, where would you decide to focus that intervention, right? It may be on students that fall within this chronic absenteeism rate of missing about 20% to about 30% of the days, right? Because they're most likely to be able to have a greater than chance probability of graduating from high school. Again, this isn't a crystal ball. It's not to say that you have to do this or you should do this. There may be other motivating reasons why you don't, in fact. It's to help reduce the uncertainties that you have in the decision that you're trying to make about how you move the needle on high school graduation, right? I also want to mention that these are all based on models, right? So we present the model specifics below for you, for those that want to kind of geek out over this kind of stuff. And some people like this and some people don't. But the truth is, you're making decisions based on models every day. They just may not be specified, right? They're models in your head. They're theories for how you think the education system is working. So I guess maybe one of the differences that we have here is we're at least specifying the accuracy of the models, right? And where in some cases, if it's just a model in your head, you may or may not be able to say the accuracy of what you're claiming. So that's the predict space. We've identified where things matter and what things matter. And the next kind of logical step or questions that we think are arising would be from people saying, okay, again, we know what things matter. We know the thresholds of where they matter. We're trying to make a decision about doing an intervention or not. What happens if we do nothing, right? Because you sometimes don't have the resources to do something all of the time. And sometimes that's just the best answer. We can't address this. But we can use these models to project into the future and then to forecast to say, if we do nothing about high school graduation, what's our best guess based on the models, based on historical data of what's expected, right? And that might influence your decision of whether or not this is something that you care about or not. So in this case, we're using some forecasting models that combine a series of different models together to project out into the future what the high school graduation rate would be, in this case, if you did not, if you maintained the status quo, right? And you have some error bands around that because there's some wiggle room. It's kind of like if you ever watch the Weather Channel when the hurricanes come into Florida, you know, you've got the cone, and as that hurricane gets closer, that cone gets smaller and smaller. It's the same concept here. But this gives you a sense of what's going to happen if you don't do anything, right? To support your decision making, to reduce the uncertainty about whether or not you focus on something. So that's forecast. The final stage then is simulate. So what do you think the next logical set of questions are that one would ask after they've identified what matters, they've identified where it matters, they know what's going to happen with some degree of confidence around the forecast? Now what do you ask yourself? You're trying to make a decision. Somebody talk loud. How do you change it? How do you impact it? Right. I think that's exactly right. You would ask yourself the question, if we actually do something, how does it impact, right, the outcome? And that's exactly what you're doing in Simulate, is you're, again, leveraging these models and others to be able to say, okay, if we go ahead and actually implement a particular intervention, what's the best guess at how much of an impact this is actually going to have on our high school graduation rate? The key piece with this is then you can begin to have conversations around things like return on investment, right? Because if you know that a particular intervention or a particular program costs X amount of dollars per pupil or X amount of dollars per each additional student that participates, and you can then quantify the potential impact of that intervention on the outcome, you can decide whether or not that cost is appropriate for the return that you're going to get, right? It's sort of a bang for your buck concept. And that's exactly what you're doing here in the simulate stage. So here we'll say that, for example, you have a current number of students that are graduating from high school, and you can select your target. You might say that, okay, we want to increase our target graduates to, 19,000, right? And if you run the simulation and you do nothing, right, you've adjusted no parameters, so this is basically what we were looking at earlier, what you find is that you have a 50-50 probability of hitting that same mark the next year, right? A 50% chance on the left-hand side of going worse, a 50% chance of getting better, right? But this is our target, 1,900 students. So what you're trying to do is say, okay, we really think that we can implement a, let's say maybe it's a mentoring program. A mentoring program that's really going to help with chronic absenteeism, and it's also designed to provide tutoring or academic support for our students, and we think we're also going to get a bump in our GPA. That's what we're expecting to happen, right? If you think about it from a logic model standpoint, those are the outputs that you're having that ultimately increase or that ultimately impact the outcomes that is high school graduation. So you say, with our new mentoring program, we're going to be able to reduce our proportion absent from 26%, which it is now. We think we can get a 10% reduction or a 10 percentage point reduction in the chronic absenteeism rate from our new program. And we also think that that might have a bump on our average high school GPA because of the tutoring component involved. And so we'll knock that up a couple hundredths of a point. You rerun your simulation. And what you find is that based on the models, and again, this is a simulation that leverages historical data, but with those kinds of interventions, we're calculating that you would have a 92% probability of falling between where you currently are with your high school graduation count at 19,694 statewide, and an 8% likelihood of exceeding that with the intervention that you just implemented. So now you do your feedback cycle, right? You might look at that and say, hey, for the amount of money we were going to spend on that program, we're quite pleased with that. Or you might say, that's all there is for resources, but we think that probably we were being a little too overzealous in the establishment of a 19,000 target. That probably is more accurately something where we say we can graduate 200 additional students. Okay, so then you think about potentially revising your target. So that would be 18,894. And you can keep your same intervention that you implement, rerun your simulation, and now you have a sense of, based on a target of 200 additional graduates, the impact of that particular intervention. Okay? So this is an example, and we have some pre-identified variables that can be used here in terms of these simulations. But part of the purpose of the Fellows Program and the conversations that we want to have with each of you is to determine what are the things, the tools, the resources that would be valuable in the simulations, in the other products that would be supportive of you. But the key is, and I guess if you get nothing else out of this presentation, is I hope this is beginning to solidify or crystallize an example of how we can use this information to actually be more beneficial in supporting decision making. That something like this can help to reduce the uncertainties that you have in the decisions that you're making around how to have an impact on these outcomes. And that's a very different thing than giving a crosstab or a report on here's the number of students who graduated, here's the number of students who didn't, and here's how it looks distributed across the state. All appropriate and necessary and needed, but by leveraging these kind of models, we can take this work into a much stronger space to really support decisions. Okay. Thank you very much. I don't know if anybody has questions. Jill, do we have a minute or two for that? Okay. What types of models are we using? There's many different models, and I've got Dr. Broderson, who's our research director, in the audience today, and he can answer those out loud, a few of them, or I can have him connect with you directly after the presentation. Max. What about access to district level data? Right, so that's where with the Fellows Program, that's exactly the intention, that we would partner with districts for those that were interested, or ESUs, to be able to leverage these tools for their particular districts or for their particular ESUs this summer, kicking off the process to build out the program this summer. Well, congratulations to you, Scott, on being $10 richer today. And if anybody wants to talk about this or, again, wants to be involved, we want to be a partner. We want to work with you, if that makes sense. Please see me. I'd be happy to take your name. We'll meet later and go from there. And thank you, Jill, for inviting us.
Thank you, Matt. He might also be willing to talk about his car. So thank you, everybody, for coming. We will be taking a quick 15-minute break and meeting back in here for the first of 2 plenary sessions. Just to let you know, those sessions are not repeated. So you'll get different information each of them. So we will see you back here in about 15 minutes. Thank you so much. There should be some refreshments out in the hall.